The envelope was sitting on the kitchen table when I came downstairs that Tuesday morning. White, legal-sized, the return address printed in clean black letters, Hargrove and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Columbus, Ohio. I had seen that return address before. It was the law firm my brother Kevin had hired 8 months before our father died. I stood at the bottom of the stairs in my socks, still holding the mug of coffee I had poured 30 seconds earlier, and stared at that envelope the way you stare at something your brain hasn't quite agreed to process yet. The kitchen smelled like it always did in the morning. Old wood, a little bit of my father's pipe tobacco that had soaked itself permanently into the walls over 40 years, and the faint sweetness of the apple from Tyler's lunch bag sitting on the counter. Everything in that kitchen was familiar. The crack in the grout above the sink that Dad always said he'd fix someday. The hook by the back door where his keys still hung, even though he had been gone for 11 weeks. The faded calendar on the refrigerator still showing March, the month he died, because neither Tyler nor I had been able to bring ourselves to flip it to April. I set my mug down and picked up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A formal notice, clean and businesslike, the kind of letter that has no interest in how you feel when you read it. Dear Ms. Carol Bennett, this letter serves as formal notification that the property located at 4412 Maplewood Lane, Columbus, Ohio, 43214 has been transferred to the sole ownership of Kevin Raymond Bennett pursuant to the last will and testament of Raymond Charles Bennett, probated March 29th. You are hereby requested to vacate the premises no later than 60 days from the date of this letter. I read it once. Then I sat down in my father's chair, the one by the window where he used to read the newspaper every morning, the one that still held the shape of him in its cushions. And I read it again. 60 days. My name is Carol Bennett. I am 44 years old. I am a registered nurse, a divorced mother, and the woman who spent the last 5 years of her life in this house, caring for the man who built it. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please stay with me until the end. Let me take you back to where this really began, because the eviction letter was not the beginning. It was simply the moment I finally understood what had been happening right in front of me for years. My father, Raymond Charles Bennett, was 76 years old when he died on March 4th, a quiet Thursday morning in early spring. He passed in his own bedroom, in his own bed, with the window cracked open the way he always liked it, even in winter. I was the one who found him. I was the one who called 911. I was the one who sat with him in those last minutes before the paramedics arrived, holding his hand, telling him it was okay to go. Kevin was in Phoenix. Kevin is my younger brother. He's 38 years old, 6 years younger than me, and he has lived in Arizona for the past 12 years with his wife Dana and their 2 kids. He works in commercial real estate. Dana sells luxury home decor online. They have a beautiful house with a pool and a guest suite and, as Dana frequently reminded anyone who would listen, a curated outdoor living space. Kevin called me approximately once a week during the 5 years I was caring for Dad, sometimes twice, if something was wrong. He visited 4 times. 4 visits in 5 years, across 2 holidays, 1 birthday, and 1 medical scare that turned out to be less serious than we feared. He always brought gifts. He always hugged Dad warmly and laughed loudly and spent the first evening full of energy and good intentions. By the 3rd day, he was restless. By the 4th, he was gone. I never said anything about this, not to Kevin, not to anyone, because that is not the kind of thing you say out loud when you are the daughter who stayed. Our mother, Eleanor, died 7 years ago from ovarian cancer. She was 68. Her death reshaped everything. It was what first made us realize Dad couldn't be left alone. The Parkinson's had been diagnosed a year earlier, and while it moved slowly in the beginning, slowly is still forward. Every month there was something new, a tremor that had worsened. A day when his words came out tangled. A morning he couldn't button his own shirt and stood in the bathroom doorway looking at his hands with an expression I never want to see on another person's face as long as I live. I was 39 when I made the decision to move back in. Tyler was 12 and in middle school. I had been renting a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, 20 minutes away. After Mom died, I was driving to Maplewood Lane every morning before work and every evening after, checking medication, making meals, handling the appointments. It was my neighbor Phyllis who finally said what I couldn't. Carol, honey, you're already living there. You're just sleeping somewhere else. She wasn't wrong. I talked to Tyler first. He was old enough to understand, and I wanted him to have a say in it. He sat across from me at our kitchen table, A serious 12-year-old with his father's dark eyes and his own particular brand of quiet wisdom, and he said, "Grandpa needs you more than I need this apartment." That was it. We packed up, we moved in, and we began what I can only describe as the longest and most important job I have ever done. I want to be clear about something. I did not move back in expecting anything in return. I want to say that plainly because the story I am about to tell you might make it seem otherwise. I moved back because Raymond Bennett was my father and he needed someone, and I was the someone who was there. But I also need to be honest. My father knew what I was doing. He told me so, more than once, in the direct way he always had. "This house will be yours and Kevin's one day, Carol. I've made sure of it." He said it clearly. He said it often. I believed him because I had no reason not to. The 5 years I spent at 4412 Maplewood Lane are not easy to summarize because they contained everything. They contained the slow, methodical work of managing Parkinson's medications on a schedule so precise that I kept a laminated chart on the refrigerator. They contained physical therapy appointments 3 mornings a week and the way Dad would grip the railing on the front steps, concentrating so hard it looked like prayer. They contained Tyler growing from a quiet 12-year-old into a 17-year-old who knew how to make his grandfather's favorite oatmeal exactly right and who would sometimes sit with him in the evenings watching old westerns without being asked. They also contained the harder things. The night Dad fell in the bathroom at 2 a.m. and I sat on the cold tile floor with him for 40 minutes waiting for the emergency team because his hip was injured and I couldn't move him alone. The afternoon he looked at me across the lunch table and called me Eleanor, my mother's name, and smiled with such genuine warmth that I smiled back and said, "Yes, it's me," and then went to the backyard and stood against the fence for 10 minutes before I could trust my own face again. Kevin called that weekend. I told him Dad had a rough few days. He said, "You're doing an amazing job, Carol. Seriously, I don't know how you do it." That sentence, "I don't know how you do it," became the phrase I learned to distrust most in the English language because it was always followed by nothing. No offer to come for a month so I could take a real vacation. No suggestion of hiring an additional aide a few days a week. Just admiration delivered from a safe distance, like applause from someone who left before the second act. In the winter of that 4th year, things changed. Dad's neurologist, Dr. Pauline Marchetti, had a quiet conversation with me after one of his appointments. Tyler was in the waiting room. Dad was getting dressed. She sat across from me in that small office with the framed diplomas and the spider plant on the windowsill, and she told me gently that we were moving into a new phase. The cognitive symptoms, she explained, were progressing alongside the motor ones now. This was not unusual for Parkinson's at this stage. What I might notice, she said carefully, was difficulty with complex decision-making, vulnerability to confusion in stressful situations, moments where his judgment might not be what it once was. She used clinical language, but what she was describing was this. My father, the man who had run a hardware business for 30 years, who had coached Little League and served on the church council and never once bounced a check in his life, was becoming someone who could be confused, who could be led. I drove home from that appointment and sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. I did not call Kevin that night. I did not know why exactly. I only knew that the conversation I had just had felt important in a way I couldn't yet articulate, and I needed to hold it carefully before I shared it with anyone. 8 months before Dad died, Kevin came to visit alone. No Dana, no kids. He stayed for a week, which was unusual. Long enough that I noticed how much time he was spending alone with Dad, walks around the block, quiet conversations in the study with the door half closed, a trip to a local notary that Kevin said was just to update some paperwork. I asked about it once. Just some financial organization, Kevin said, with the easy smile he had been deploying since childhood to end conversations he didn't want to have. Dad wanted to get things in order. You know how he is. I did know how he was. I also knew, somewhere quiet and animal in the back of my mind, that Dr. Marchetti's words from the year before were pressing against this moment trying to be heard. But Kevin was my brother. My father was nodding along and seemed comfortable. And I was tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones after 4 years of night check-ins and medication schedules and watching someone you love grow smaller by degrees. So I said okay and went back to the kitchen and made dinner. That was the decision I will spend a long time rearranging in my memory, turning it over like a stone to see what lives underneath. Not the decision itself, just how quietly I made it. How easily I let it pass. Dad died on a Thursday in early March, as I said. The funeral was on a Saturday. Kevin and Dana arrived Friday evening with matching luggage and the careful, practiced grief of people who had prepared for this moment from a safe emotional distance. They were composed where I was wrecked. Dana kept touching my arm and saying, "He's at peace now, Carol. He really is." I kept nodding because there was nothing else to do with my hands. The house was full of people for 3 days. Neighbors, church friends, former customers from the hardware store who were now in their 70s and 80s themselves, people who remembered Dad from before I was born. My friend Miriam drove up from Cincinnati and stayed 2 nights on the couch without being asked. Tyler stood in the receiving line for 4 hours in his grandfather's house wearing the tie he'd borrowed from his school blazer, shaking hands with people he barely knew, and I watched him do it and thought, this boy is going to be fine. Kevin gave a beautiful eulogy. I want to say that fairly, because it is true. He stood at the podium in St. Anthony's and talked about our father with real love and real specificity, the smell of his workshop, the way he could fix anything with duct tape in 3 minutes of thought, the particular patience he had on fishing trips. People laughed, people cried. Afterward, 3 different people told me what a wonderful son Raymond had. I drove home alone after the reception. Kevin and Dana were staying at a hotel because, as Dana explained, we didn't want to crowd the house. The house where I had lived for 5 years. The house with my name on the utilities and Tyler's sneakers by the back door and my nursing badges hanging from the hook in the kitchen. That night, after Tyler was asleep, I sat in my father's chair and felt the particular silence that moves into a house after someone has died. Not emptiness, something heavier, presence without the person. The will reading was the following Tuesday at the offices of Hargrove and Associates. I want to tell you that I walked in prepared for something. That some instinct, some memory of Kevin's quiet week 8 months before had put up a flag somewhere in my thinking. But honestly, I didn't feel afraid. I felt the way you feel when you approach a procedure you have watched 100 times. Familiar, procedural, slightly numb at the edges. The attorney's name was Bradley Hargrove. He was in his early 50s, trim, with the kind of careful politeness that law school produces in certain people like a finish coat. He shook our hands. He offered water. He opened a folder. The will he read was dated June 14th of the previous year. As he read, I became aware of a sound, a low, steady ringing, somewhere behind my eardrums. Not a real sound. The body's way of compensating when information is arriving faster than the mind can sort it. Kevin received the house at 4412 Maplewood Lane in full. Kevin received the savings and investment accounts totaling $268,000. Kevin received the contents of the workshop and garage. Kevin received the 2019 Ford F-150. I received, and I am quoting directly, all personal effects, jewelry, and sentimental items to be distributed at the discretion of the executor. The executor was Kevin. I sat very still. Beside me, Kevin's expression was composed, not triumphant, composed. The expression of a man who had already processed this information and decided how he would sit when it was delivered. "Ms. Bennett," Bradley Hargrove said, and I realized he had asked me something. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from another room. "Could you repeat that?" He repeated it. He was asking if I had any questions. I looked at the date on the document again. June 14th, 8 months before Dad died. 1 month after Kevin's solo visit. 7 months after Dr. Marchetti sat across from me and told me my father's judgment was becoming unreliable under pressure. "Who drafted this will?" I asked. "Our firm," Hargrove said. "And who engaged your firm?" A slight pause. "Your brother contacted us in May of last year." Was my father represented by his own attorney when this was signed? Another pause, smaller but present. "Your father signed of his own accord. There was a witness and a notary present." "That wasn't what I asked," I said quietly. Hargrove looked at his folder. "I'm not aware of separate counsel being involved." "No." I nodded. I picked up my purse. I thanked him for his time in the same voice I used when I was ending a conversation at the nurse's station that had gone on too long. Kevin walked me to the parking lot. He put his hand on my shoulder with the practiced sincerity of someone who has rehearsed this gesture. "Carol, I know this is hard." I turned and looked at him. He is 6 years younger than me, and standing in that parking lot in his pressed shirt and his good shoes, he looked even younger than that. He looked like someone who had decided something and was now waiting for the consequences to be smaller than he feared. "Kevin," I said, "when exactly did Dad tell you to contact that law firm?" "Dad and I talked a lot about estate planning," he said smoothly. "He wanted things simplified." Simplified? He was worried about probate complexity. He just wanted it streamlined. I looked at him for another moment. The ringing behind my ears had settled into a faint, steady hum. "Okay," I said. I got in my car. I drove home to Maplewood Lane. I walked into the kitchen, put my purse on the counter, sat down at the table where my father had eaten breakfast for 40 years, and I stared at the wall. 60 days to vacate. Tyler was at school. The house was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a cardinal was insisting on itself in the bare branches of the maple tree Dad had planted the year I was born. I sat there for a long time. The letter from Hargrove arrived 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning, which is where I began this story. In the weeks between the will reading and that envelope, I had done what I always do when I am overwhelmed. I worked. I went to my shifts at the hospital. I made Tyler's lunches. I answered Kevin's texts with the careful brevity of someone choosing every word. He had already called a real estate agent to assess the property, just to understand options, he said. Dana had emailed asking whether the living room furniture was going with me or available. I had started going through my father's things slowly in the evenings after Tyler went to bed. Not packing. I couldn't pack yet. Just moving through the rooms the way you do when you are trying to memorize something before it changes. It was on one of those evenings, a Wednesday about 10 days after the will reading, that I found the Bible. It was in his bedside drawer, a King James version with a cracked spine and tissue-thin pages marked throughout in my father's handwriting. He had been religious in a quiet, private way, not a loud Sunday performance faith, but the kind that lives in a person steadily and doesn't need an audience. This Bible had been his mother's and then his, and I had seen it in that drawer my entire life. I sat on the edge of his bed and opened it carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to someone who is no longer there to approve of your touching it. There was a photograph tucked behind the front cover, me and Tyler at the beach summer before last. Dad had asked Tyler to print it and frame it, but we had never gotten around to the frame. I smoothed the corner that had curled, and then, in the back of the Bible, pressed between the final pages of Revelation and the blank end paper, I found a folded piece of notepaper. My father's handwriting, immediately recognizable, the careful, slightly unsteady print of a man whose hands no longer cooperated the way they once had, but who was still trying. I unfolded it. It was a letter, undated, 4 paragraphs, written in pencil, which was unusual for him, and which I realized later might have been because pencils are easier to control than pens when your hands shake. I am not going to quote the letter to you in full because some of it was private in the way that a man's last written words are private, but I will tell you what it contained because what it contained was the reason everything that happened next was possible. He wrote that he was confused. That is the word he used. Confused. He wrote that Kevin had come to visit and that they had talked about the house and the money and what would happen after he was gone. He wrote that Kevin had explained things to him and that it had all seemed reasonable in the moment, but that afterward, when Kevin had gone back to Phoenix, he had begun to feel unsettled, like something had moved inside the house while he wasn't watching, and now he couldn't locate it. He wrote that he had wanted to call his own lawyer, a man named George Whitmore who had handled his and Mom's affairs for over 20 years, but that Kevin had said George was retired and that the new firm was handling everything. And then he wrote this. I have read this particular sentence so many times that I could recite it without blinking. I want Carol to know that this house was always meant for both of them, equal shares, the way Eleanor and I always planned. If something doesn't look right when the time comes, she should call George. George will know. He had signed it with his full name, Raymond Charles Bennett, the way he always signed important things. I sat on the edge of his bed with that note in my hands until the room was completely dark. I didn't turn on the light. I sat in the dark and held the paper and listened to the cardinal outside, which had gone quiet with the sun. Then I went to the kitchen, found my laptop, and searched for George Whitmore, attorney at law, Columbus, Ohio. He was not retired. His office was 12 minutes from Maplewood Lane. His phone number was listed plainly on his website. He had been practicing law in Columbus for 31 years. There was a photograph, a large man with white hair and an open, direct expression, the kind of face that belongs on someone who has spent decades listening to people tell him the truth. I looked at the clock. It was 9:47 in the evening. I looked at the phone number. I looked at the letter again. Then I went to the cabinet above the stove where I had always kept the household files. Utilities, insurance, medical records, everything organized in labeled folders the way my nursing training had made second nature to me. And I opened the medical folder and pulled out Dr. Marchetti's last 3 visit summaries for my father. I sat back down at the table with George Whitmore's number on my screen, Dr. Marchetti's reports in my hand, and my father's letter on the table between them. In 8 months at Hargrove and Associates, no one had asked for my father's medical records. No one had spoken to his physician. A man with documented progressive Parkinson's-related cognitive symptoms had signed a will that completely disinherited one of his 2 children, the one who had lived with him and cared for him for 5 years. And the attorney who drafted that will had been hired not by my father, but by the child who stood to inherit everything. I thought about Kevin's easy smile in the parking lot. He just wanted it streamlined. I thought about my father standing in the bathroom doorway, looking at his hands. I thought about the note in his Bible. If something doesn't look right when the time comes, she should call George. I picked up my phone. It was almost 10 o'clock at night. Too late to call a law office, but George Whitmore's website had a contact form, and at the bottom of the form there was a line in small print. For urgent estate matters, leave a message at the after-hours line and we will return your call within 24 hours. I dialed the number. A voicemail picked up. I spoke carefully, the way I speak when I am giving a patient report at shift change. Measured, specific, no wasted words. I gave my name. I gave my father's name. I said that I had reason to believe his final will had been executed under circumstances that did not reflect his true wishes, and that I had documentation I would like his office to review. Then I said one more thing, because I had decided somewhere in the last 2 hours that I was done keeping the peace at the cost of the truth. My father left me a note, I said. He told me to call you. I'm calling. I hung up. Outside, the maple tree my father had planted the year I was born was a dark shape against the darker sky. The house around me was quiet. My father's house, which in 60 days would no longer be mine to stand in, or so my brother believed. I folded the eviction letter, slipped it into the kitchen file folder where I kept important documents, and placed my father's note carefully on top, smoothed flat, like something worth preserving. Then I went upstairs, checked that Tyler was asleep, stood in the doorway of his room for a moment just to hear him breathe, and walked to my own room. I did not sleep. But for the first time since the will reading, I did not feel the particular helplessness of someone with nothing left to do. I had my father's words. I had his medical records. I had the name of a lawyer who had known Raymond Bennett for over 20 years. And I had something else, something that had been growing quietly under the surface of the last 3 weeks, patient and inevitable, the way certain things only grow in the dark. I had finally started asking the right questions. George Whitmore called at 7:52 the next morning. I was standing at the kitchen counter making Tyler's breakfast when my phone lit up with a Columbus area code I didn't recognize. Tyler was still upstairs. The maple tree outside the window was catching the early light in a way that made it look almost bronze. And I remember thinking, for one disconnected second, that my father would have noticed that and said something about it. He always noticed light. I answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was unhurried, low, the kind of voice that has learned over decades not to waste itself on speed. Ms. Bennett, this is George Whitmore returning your call from last evening. I apologize for the hour. Your message indicated some urgency, and I wanted to reach you before my first appointment. Thank you for calling, I said. I wasn't sure you would. Your father and I worked together for 22 years, he said simply. When someone tells me Raymond Bennett left a note, I call. I exhaled slowly through my nose. Something in my chest, which had been wound tight as a clock spring since the will reading, shifted very slightly. We arranged to meet that afternoon at his office on Henderson Road. He asked me to bring anything relevant, documents, medical records, correspondence. He did not ask me to summarize the situation over the phone, which I appreciated. He said only, bring everything and we'll look at it together. I told Tyler that morning at breakfast that I had an appointment with an attorney. He looked up from his cereal with the focused attention he had always given to information that mattered. About Grandpa's will? He asked. Yes. He nodded slowly. Uncle Kevin got everything. It wasn't a question. Tyler had overheard more than I had realized, not deliberately, but the way 17-year-olds absorb things through walls and half-closed doors and the particular silence adults use when they think they're hiding something. There are some questions about how the will was prepared, I said carefully. I'm going to talk to someone who knew Grandpa a long time. And Tyler stirred his cereal for a moment. Mom, he said, Grandpa told me once that this house was going to take care of us. Last summer, when we were in the backyard, he said it specifically. I set my coffee mug down. He said that to you? He said, Tyler paused, getting the words right the way he always did. He said, this house has always looked after the people in it, and it's going to keep doing that. And then he kind of looked at it. You know how he used to look at it and he said, "Your mother has earned every room of it." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why didn't you tell me that?" I asked softly. "Because you seemed like you were holding everything together," he said, "and I didn't want to be the thing that made you stop." I looked at my son across the breakfast table. 17 years old. In 2 years, he would be in college. In 20 years, he might be sitting across from his own child at a table like this, and I hoped, with a fierceness I couldn't quite contain, that the world he was living in by then was a fairer one than the one we were sitting in right now. "Tell that to the attorney," I said. "Exactly what you just told me." He met my eyes. Okay. George Whitmore's office was nothing like Hargrove and Associates. Where Hargrove had been all clean lines and careful presentation, the kind of office designed to project confidence in its own cost, Whitmore's space looked like the inside of a man who had been practicing law long enough to stop caring what his office said about him. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves, on the credenza, on one corner of the desk in a pile that suggested ongoing use rather than decoration. A rubber plant in the corner that was leggy but clearly alive. Family photographs arranged on the windowsill without symmetry. He stood when I came in. He was exactly as the website photograph suggested. Large, white-haired, with the unhurried physicality of someone who had made peace with taking up space. His handshake was firm without performance. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "please sit down." I sat. I placed the folder I had brought on the edge of his desk. Medical records, the will document Hargrove had provided at the reading, the eviction notice, and my father's note, still in the envelope I had put it in the night before. "Before we go through any of this," Whitmore said, settling into his chair, "I want to tell you something about your father." I nodded. Raymond Bennett was one of the clearest thinking clients I have ever worked with. Not the wealthiest, not the most complicated case, but the clearest. He knew exactly what he wanted, he said it plainly, and he didn't change his mind casually. He paused. Which is why, when I learned he had engaged a different firm for his estate work without contacting me, I found it unusual. I didn't pursue it because clients are entitled to change attorneys, but I found it unusual. "When did you learn about it?" I asked. "I received a notification from the probate court after his death as a matter of standard procedure. Attorney of record had changed." He folded his hands on the desk. "I noted it. I didn't know the circumstances. Now, apparently, I do." He looked at the folder on his desk. "Show me what you have." I opened the folder and walked him through it in order. Dr. Marchetti's visit summaries first, then the will dated June 14th, then the eviction notice, and finally the note from the Bible. I placed the note in front of him last, carefully, as though it were a document being entered into a record that it perhaps one day would be. He read slowly. He did not react the way television has trained us to expect lawyers to react. No dramatic intake of breath. No leaning forward with widened eyes. He simply read. When he finished Dr. Marchetti's notes, he made a brief notation on the legal pad beside him. When he finished the will, he was quiet for a long moment. When he reached the note, he read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at me. "Your brother told you George Whitmore was retired," he said. "Yes." "I practiced real estate law for 15 years before transitioning to estate and probate," he said calmly. "I have no plans to retire. Your brother was either misinformed or he wasn't." The precision of that last sentence, its refusal to choose between the two options out loud, told me a great deal about George Whitmore as an attorney. "What does the medical record tell you?" I asked. He leaned back slightly. "Individually, nothing enforceable. Together, with everything else, quite a bit." He tapped the legal pad. "Dr. Marchetti documented progressive cognitive involvement beginning in the spring of 2 years ago. The will was signed 14 months later. In that window, your father's own physician was on record noting that his judgment could be unreliable under pressure. Kevin's visit was in May," I said. "The will was signed June 14th. 1 month later." Whitmore nodded. "And the firm was engaged by your brother, not your father." "Is that relevant legally?" "It is relevant to the question of independent representation," he said. "For a will to withstand a challenge on grounds of undue influence, one of the things courts look at is whether the testator, the person making the will, had independent counsel, someone whose obligation was to him and him alone, not to the person who would benefit from the outcome." He looked at the Hargrove document. Your brother selected and engaged this firm. He was present during the visit preceding the signature. The will, coincidentally, left him everything. He said the word coincidentally with the dry precision of a man who didn't believe in it. Can I contest it? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Contesting a will is not simple, and I want to be honest with you about that. Courts do not overturn wills lightly. What you are describing, undue influence by a beneficiary, possible cognitive vulnerability in the testator, lack of independent representation. These are recognized grounds. They require evidence, documentation, and almost certainly testimony. He looked at the Bible note again. This helps considerably. A handwritten statement in your father's own words expressing that the intended distribution was equal and specifically naming me as someone to contact if something appeared wrong. That is not nothing. He knew, I said quietly. He knew something was off. It appears he did, Whitmore said, which means whatever confusion Kevin introduced in that May visit didn't sit right with Raymond afterward. He paused, may not have known how to undo it. I thought about my father in the bathroom doorway, looking at his hands with that expression. He wrote the note and put it in his Bible, I said, because he knew I would find it. Yes, Whitmore said simply. We sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. Tell me everything you remember about the 5 years you lived in that house. Expenses you contributed to, home modifications, medical arrangements you coordinated, everything. I spent the next hour talking. In the 2 weeks that followed, I learned what it looks like when a methodical person builds a case. George Whitmore did not rush. He requested documents, made phone calls, and organized information with the patience of someone who understood that the strength of what you build depends on the integrity of the foundation beneath it. He filed no motions yet and made no announcements. He told me early on, we gather first, we act when we know what we're acting on. What we gathered across those 2 weeks was considerable. Dr. Marchetti agreed to provide a formal written statement, not testimony yet, but documentation of her clinical observations and what they indicated about Raymond Bennett's cognitive state during the months preceding the will signing. She was careful and clinical in her language, which Whitmore said was exactly right. Dramatic doesn't hold up, he told me. Precise does. Whitmore also located the notary who had witnessed the will signing. The notary, a woman named Sandra Eck, who worked from a small office in Worthington, confirmed by phone that Kevin had been present in the room when Raymond signed. She had noted nothing unusual at the time, she said, but she acknowledged that she had had no prior acquaintance with Raymond Bennett, no knowledge of his medical history, and no reason to ask questions about his relationship to the man who had arranged the appointment. She also confirmed that there had been no independent attorney present. Standard for simple wills, Whitmore explained to me later, but this was not a simple will. This was a document that disinherited one of 2 children entirely after decades of estate planning that had consistently treated them equally. For a change of that magnitude, independent counsel becomes considerably more important. He had also reviewed the original estate plan he had prepared for my parents years earlier, which remained in his files. Under that plan, the plan my father and mother had created together before her death, the property on Maplewood Lane and the financial accounts were to be divided equally between Kevin and me, with a provision that any child who had served as a primary caregiver in the final years would receive an additional share adjustment. My mother had insisted on that clause specifically, Whitmore told me, because she wanted to make sure, in her words, the one who does the work is not the one who loses. That sentence knocked the air out of me when he read it. My mother, 7 years gone, had thought of this, had tried to protect me from exactly this, and Kevin had walked my father into a different attorney's office and walked out with a different document that erased it all. I told Miriam on a Sunday night phone call that lasted 2 hours. Miriam has been my closest friend since nursing school, which means she has known me through a divorce, 2 job changes, a crosstown move, and 5 years of caregiving. She has a particular quality I have always admired. She listens completely before she says anything, and when she says something, it lands. She was quiet for a long moment after I told her about my mother's clause. Carol, she said finally, your mother knew Kevin. I had not thought about it quite that way, but she was right. Eleanor Bennett had watched her children grow up. She had seen, as mothers do, the specific contours of who they each were. She had put language in a legal document specifically designed to prevent what had happened. She had just underestimated Kevin's initiative. Kevin called on a Wednesday evening, 12 days after I had spoken with Whitmore. I was at the kitchen table grading a stack of Tyler's old college application essays. He was revising one of them for the third time, and I had offered to read it fresh when the phone rang. Kevin's name on the screen. I had been expecting this call with the particular fatalism of someone waiting for weather. I let it ring once more. Then I answered. "Hey," he said. His voice had a specific quality I recognized, the careful casualness of someone who wants to seem like he is calling without a reason. "Hi, Kevin. Just checking in, seeing how you're doing." "I'm doing fine," I said. "How are Dana and the kids?" We did 3 minutes of this. Surface conversation, the kind that used to constitute most of our contact, filling space without saying anything. I let him lead it. I didn't help him. Finally. "I heard you reached out to George Whitmore." There it was. I felt the specific settling that happens when something you have anticipated actually arrives. Not relief, exactly. Stillness. "Yes," I said. "I did." "Carol." A slight shift in his voice, not quite warning, not quite appeal. "You don't need to do this." "Do what?" "Make this complicated. Dad's wishes were clear. He wanted things simplified," I said. "Yes, you mentioned that in the parking lot." A pause. "This is going to be expensive," he said, "and hard for both of us. And at the end of it, the will is going to stand, and you're going to have spent money you don't have on a fight you can't win." I had thought, before this call came, about what I would say when it did. I had gone through several versions, the measured version, the quiet version, the version where I said very little and listened carefully. What I had not planned on was the feeling that arrived when I actually heard his voice making those arguments. Not anger exactly, something older and more settled than anger. "Kevin," I said, "do you remember what Dad used to say about the house?" Silence. "He used to say the house was built to last," I continued. "He said Grandpa Bennett chose that lot because it was on high ground. He said," and this is almost word for word, because he said it probably 50 times over the years. He said, "A house on high ground takes care of what's inside it." Kevin said nothing. "I've been in that house for 5 years," I said. "I know every room of it. I know where the floor creaks and where the insulation is thin and why the back door sticks in August. I know those things because I was there, Kevin, every day, and Dad knew I was there, and whatever happened in May with that law firm, Dad wrote down what he actually wanted and put it somewhere he knew I would find it." More silence. "He left a note," Kevin said finally. His voice had changed, lower now, less polished. "He left a note," I confirmed. "That's not, a note isn't a legal—" "I know what it is and what it isn't," I said calmly. "So does George." A long pause. When Kevin spoke again, something in his tone had shifted from negotiating to something raw. "I didn't force him to do anything," he said. "He was willing. He understood what he was signing." "He was a man with progressive Parkinson's-related cognitive changes," I said, "who was presented with a complex estate document by the child who benefited from it, with no independent attorney present to ask him whether this reflected what he truly wanted." Silence. "He got confused sometimes," Kevin said, quieter now. "That's all. He still knew what he wrote it down himself, Kevin." My voice stayed steady. I had learned steadiness in 20 years of nursing. The ability to say difficult things in a quiet register without flinching. He wrote that the house was always meant to be equal shares. He wrote that he felt confused after your visit. He wrote that if something didn't look right, I should call George. I paused. He spelled it out in pencil because his hands shook too much for a pen. And he put it in his Bible because he knew that was the one place I would always look. The line was very quiet. "I need you to stop this," Kevin said. Not commanding now, almost something else. "I can't," I said simply. He asked me not to. I ended the call, set the phone on the table, and sat for a moment in the kitchen that still smelled like 40 years of my father's life. Then I picked up my pen and went back to Tyler's essay. 3 days later, Kevin's attorney contacted Whitmore directly. Whitmore told me about it over the phone in his unhurried way. "Bradley Hargrove reached out this morning. He wants a conversation about potential resolution before anything is filed." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," Whitmore said, with a precision that I was beginning to recognize as his version of satisfaction, "that they have reviewed their position and found it somewhat less comfortable than they expected." He explained what he had sent Hargrove's office the previous week. Not a formal filing, but a letter laying out the grounds for a will contest. The documented cognitive timeline, the lack of independent counsel, the circumstances of the will's preparation, and the existence of a prior estate plan showing a consistent, equal distribution intention across more than 15 years. He had also mentioned, carefully, that he had spoken with the notary and with Dr. Marchetti, and that both had provided written statements. "And my father's note?" I asked. "Included," he said, "authenticated against handwriting samples from his previous correspondence with my office. The match is clear." "What happens in a conversation about resolution?" I asked. "What are they likely to propose?" "They'll come in low," Whitmore said. "They'll offer something, possibly a cash settlement, possibly a partial stake in the property. They'll frame it as generosity. It won't be." He paused. "I want you to think carefully about what outcome you actually want before that conversation happens. Not what's fair in the abstract, what you need, what serves you and Tyler going forward." I thought about it that evening after Tyler went to bed. What did I want? I sat in my father's chair, I still thought of it as his, and looked at the room around me. The built-in bookshelves he had made himself, the fireplace he had repointed the summer I was 12, the front window with its view of the maple tree that had been taller than me for as long as I could remember. I wanted Tyler to be able to come home for holidays and still know where home was. I wanted to not spend the next 20 years wondering whether the woman who moved into this house after me maintained the window seals the way they needed to be maintained or understood why the radiator in the back bedroom needed to be bled every November. I wanted, though I could not say this to anyone yet without it sounding like something smaller than it was, to be able to sit in the backyard on a summer evening and feel my father's presence in the soil of the garden he had kept for 40 years. But beneath all of that, quieter, harder, more essential, I wanted something that had nothing to do with the house itself. I wanted someone, somewhere, to say out loud what Kevin had done. I wanted the record to reflect the truth of what had happened in that May visit, and what it had cost me, and what it had cost my father, who had been confused enough to sign something he didn't believe and clear-sighted enough to leave me a note telling me so. I wanted the account to be accurate. The next morning, I called Whitmore. "I want the house," I said, "or at minimum my equal share of it as the original plan specified. And I want it documented, whatever is filed, whatever is settled, that the basis for the contest was undue influence. I don't want it buried in vague language about mutual agreement." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "That second part may complicate negotiation," he said carefully. "I know," I said. "It's still what I want." Another pause, and then something that might, in someone less restrained, have been the beginning of approval. "All right," he said. "Then let's make sure we're fully prepared before we sit down with them." What I did not anticipate in those weeks of gathering and waiting was Tyler. Not that he surprised me. Tyler had been surprising me in the best possible sense since he was about 4 years old. But what he did on a Saturday afternoon in early May caught me completely off guard. I came home from a long shift to find him at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He had been using my office supplies since middle school, the way teenagers colonize the things that surround them. And he was writing, not homework, something deliberate, the pen moving in that particular way he had when he was trying to get something exactly right. He looked up when I came in. "I wrote out what Grandpa said to me," he told me, "in the backyard, about the house. I tried to remember as close to exactly as I could, and I wrote down when it was the Saturday after 4th of July because we had leftover potato salad, which sounds weird, but that's how I know. And who was there, which was just me and him." He slid the legal pad across the table. It was 2 paragraphs, handwritten, dated and noted with the specific circumstantial detail he had described. The kind of statement a careful person writes when they understand that specificity is the difference between memory and testimony. I read it twice. "Tyler." "Whitmore should have it," he said simply. "Right?" "Yes," I said. "He should." I also wrote down the things Grandpa used to say at dinner, the ones about the house being for the family. I wrote down probably 6 separate instances where he said something like that, with approximate dates based on what was happening at the time. Like, he said something during my 8th grade graduation dinner, and something else the Christmas that the furnace broke. He pushed a second page across. "I know it's not legal testimony, but it's a pattern." I looked at my son. I thought about the conversation we had had at the same table weeks ago, when he told me he hadn't wanted to say anything because I seemed like I was holding everything together. "You've been thinking about this for a while," I said. "Since the will reading," he said. I knew something was wrong. Grandpa told me things. He talked to me more than people think teenagers want to be talked to. He said this last part with the slight self-consciousness of someone who has just admitted something that might seem unusual for a 17-year-old, and I felt the full weight of who my son was, who he had been allowed to become, in part because of the years spent in a house with a grandfather who talked to him like a person and a mother who modeled what it looked like to show up. "Grandpa told me once," Tyler said, quieter now, "that the two most important things a person can do are keep their word and take care of the people who can't take care of themselves yet." He looked at the table for a moment. "He was talking about you, taking care of him. He said he knew what it cost you and he wanted me to know it too." I did not trust my voice for a moment. "He said that," I managed finally. "He said it pretty clearly." Tyler met my eyes. So I've been keeping track." I called Whitmore that evening. He was pleased in his contained way about Tyler's written account. "A grandchild's recollection, with specificity and circumstantial grounding," he said, "is useful, particularly given your son's age. He's old enough that his testimony would be treated seriously." "He's been doing this on his own," I said. "I didn't ask him to." "That," Whitmore said, "is in many ways the most useful thing about it." The meeting with Hargrove's office was scheduled for the 3rd week of May. I did not sleep well the night before. I lay in the dark in my room, the room I had lived in for 5 years, the room with the water stain on the ceiling above the window that my father had patched twice and never quite resolved. And I went through the sequence of what I knew the way I used to review patient charts before a difficult procedure, not to calm myself down, just to be certain I had not missed anything. What I had: medical documentation, an independent attorney with 22 years of history with my father, a handwritten note in Raymond Bennett's own hand, the prior estate plan showing consistent equal share intent for over 15 years, a statement from the notary confirming the absence of independent counsel, a written clinical statement from Dr. Marchetti, Tyler's documented recollections, what they had: a signed will, a notary, the legal presumption that a signed document reflects the signer's intent, what would determine the outcome, whether a court looked at the full picture and concluded that the signed will reflected what my father actually wanted, or what someone else had persuaded a confused, grieving, Parkinson's-affected man to put his name to on a June afternoon when his own attorney, the one who had known him for 22 years, wasn't in the room. I got up at 5:30, made coffee, sat in the kitchen as the sky outside went from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a May morning in Ohio. The maple tree was in full leaf now. My father had always said May was when the house looked most like itself. Tyler came down at 7, still in his pajamas, his hair unorganized. He poured cereal, sat across from me, and looked at my face with the evaluating steadiness he had inherited from no one I could clearly identify. "You ready?" he asked. "Almost," I said. He nodded and ate his cereal. We didn't need more than that. At 9 o'clock, I drove to George Whitmore's office on Henderson Road for the last time before the meeting. He was standing at the window when I arrived, looking at something in the parking lot below, a large, unhurried man who seemed incapable of being caught off guard. He turned when I came in. "How are you?" "I'm ready," I said. He studied me for a moment. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Then let's go," he said simply. "And Carol." He used my first name, which he rarely did. "Whatever happens in that room today, you should know that your father knew what he was asking you to do when he wrote that note. He knew it wasn't small." I thought about pencil on notepaper, the effort it would have cost his hands to write it, the clarity it required of his mind to decide to hide it somewhere I would find. "He raised me to finish things," I said. Whitmore nodded once. He picked up his briefcase. We walked out into the May morning together. The meeting with Kevin's attorneys was in 2 hours. And for the first time since I had sat in a parking lot after a will reading listening to my brother talk about streamlining, for the first time since I had driven home alone to a house that a document said no longer belonged to me, I did not feel like someone who had run out of options. I felt like my father's daughter, which, it turned out, was exactly what I needed to be. Bradley Hargrove's conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had a fountain in the lobby and a parking validation system that required 3 separate steps to operate. I noticed these things the way you notice irrelevant details when your mind is working very hard on something else. George Whitmore and I arrived 7 minutes early. The receptionist offered us water and coffee with the pleasant efficiency of someone whose job is to make people comfortable in rooms where uncomfortable things happen. I took the water. Whitmore took nothing. He set his briefcase on the table, opened it with the unhurried competence I had come to associate with him over the past weeks, and arranged his documents without looking up. "There'll be a few minutes," he said, not as a prediction, but as a statement of strategy. "It's intentional. Don't let it reset your footing." I nodded. I looked out the window at Columbus spread below us, the Scioto River catching morning light, the green of the parks, the ordinary grid of streets that contained the ordinary lives of people who were not sitting in a 14th floor conference room waiting to fight their brother for their father's house. 8 minutes later, the door opened. Bradley Hargrove came in first, trim and composed in a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Behind him came a woman I didn't recognize, younger, dark-haired, with a tablet and the focused expression of someone who takes notes and takes them well. And behind her came Kevin. I had not known he would be there in person. I had assumed, I think I had needed to assume, that this would be a lawyer's-only conversation, a negotiation conducted at the professional remove of people who are paid to manage other people's conflicts. Seeing him walk into that room in a blue blazer I recognized from family Christmases hit me somewhere I hadn't prepared. He looked tired. That was the first thing I noticed. The careful composure he had worn at the will reading, the practiced ease of the parking lot. Both of them were still there, but thinner now. Worn at the edges in the way that things wear when they are working harder than they should have to. He met my eyes for a moment when he sat down. Then he looked at the table. Hargrove arranged his own documents and cleared his throat with the small ceremony of a man calling a room to order. "Thank you both for making time," he began. "We appreciate Mr. Whitmore's willingness to engage in a preliminary discussion before any formal—" "Bradley." Whitmore's voice was pleasant and completely flat. "We both know why we're here. Let's use the time well." A brief pause. Then Hargrove nodded, and something in the room shifted slightly. The specific shift that happens when one person establishes the tempo and everyone else adjusts to it. "Our position," Hargrove said, "is that the will of Raymond Bennett, executed June 14th, is legally valid. It was witnessed, notarized, and signed by a man who was legally competent to execute a testamentary document." "Your position notes legal competency," Whitmore said. "Our position addresses something more specific, whether the document reflects Mr. Bennett's actual wishes, or whether it reflects wishes that were introduced to him by a beneficiary during a period when his own physician had documented progressive vulnerability to undue influence." Hargrove's expression remained composed. "Undue influence is a high bar." "It is," Whitmore agreed, "and we're prepared to meet it." He opened his folder and began to lay documents on the table with the methodical patience of someone who has done this many times. Dr. Marchetti's clinical statement, the original estate plan from 15 years prior, his own summary of the timeline, Tyler's written account, which he had formatted on firm letterhead with Tyler's signature at the bottom, and last, placed in the center of the table without commentary, a photocopy of my father's note, his handwriting visible even at this distance. His full name signed at the bottom in the unsteady but deliberate print of a man whose hands shook and who signed it anyway. Kevin looked at the note. Something moved across his face. Fast, barely there, the way a person flinches when they have trained themselves not to. I watched it happen, and I did not look away. "Mr. Bennett's note," Whitmore said calmly, "was authenticated against handwriting samples from correspondence he conducted with my office over 22 years. It is in his hand. It is unambiguous in content. It expresses that the intended distribution was equal shares, that he felt confused following his son's visit in May, and that he specifically directed his daughter to contact me if the outcome appeared inconsistent with his wishes." He paused. He hid it in a Bible because he understood that something had gone wrong and he wanted to create a record of his actual intent that existed outside the formal documents. The room was quiet. "He was a man with Parkinson's," Hargrove said, but more carefully now. "His perception of events may not accurately reflect—" "He was a man who ran a hardware business for 30 years, Whitmore said, "who raised 2 children, maintained a home, and managed his own affairs until the final months of his life. His physician's notes reflect cognitive vulnerability under pressure and in complex decision-making contexts, not an inability to know what he wanted for his own family. He looks steadily at Hargrove. What they reflect is exactly the kind of vulnerability that a beneficiary should not be exploiting in a room without independent counsel present. Silence. I had not spoken yet. I had decided before walking into this room that I would let Whitmore establish the ground. He had told me in our final preparation meeting the previous day that my role was presence, not argument. You being here, he had said, is its own statement. You don't need to perform anything, just be the person you are. So I sat with my hands flat on the table and I looked at my brother and I waited. Kevin was looking at the photocopy of the note again. After a moment, Hargrove said something quietly to his associate, who made a notation on her tablet. Then he looked at Whitmore. What is your client seeking? The distribution specified in the original estate plan, Whitmore said. Equal shares of the property of 4412 Maplewood Lane and equal division of the liquid assets, the savings and investment accounts. In addition, a formal acknowledgement in any settlement agreement that the June 14th will did not reflect Raymond Bennett's consistently expressed wishes regarding equal distribution. That acknowledgement would expose my client to an accurate record, Whitmore said. Yes. Another silence, longer this time. Hargrove was looking at his documents, but his eyes were not moving across them the way a person's eyes move when they are reading. He was thinking. It was Kevin who broke the silence. I didn't make him do anything. His voice was quieter than I expected, lower than his courtroom lobby register, lower than his phone call register, almost private, the way someone's voice gets when they have stopped performing and arrived at something real. Everyone at the table looked at him. I want to say that, he continued. I need to say that. He signed it. He understood what he was signing. He stopped, pressed his fingers briefly against the table. I explained things to him, the tax implications, the complications with joint ownership. I laid it out and he agreed. He said this last part with the emphasis of someone who has told it to himself so many times it has taken on the quality of certainty. I looked at my brother for a long moment. Kevin, I said. My voice was even. He wrote it down, in pencil, because his hands couldn't hold a pen steadily enough. I kept my eyes on him. He didn't write it down because he was confused. He wrote it down because he was clear enough to know that what he had agreed to in May wasn't what he actually believed, and that he might not be strong enough or coherent enough on the right day to undo it. Kevin said nothing. You explained the tax implications, I continued, and then you went back to Phoenix. And he sat in that house, in his chair, probably at the kitchen table, and he thought about what he had signed, and it didn't feel right, and he picked up a pencil and he wrote down the truth because that was the only thing he still had full control of. The room held the weight of that. Kevin looked at the photocopy of the note again. His jaw was tight. He was my father, too, he said quietly. I know, I said, but I was there, Kevin, every day, when he couldn't button his shirt, when he fell at 2 a.m, when he looked at me across the lunch table and called me Mom's name, and I smiled and said yes because it made him happy and because it was easier than watching him realize what had happened. My voice stayed even. I had been a nurse for 20 years, and I knew how to say hard things without fracturing them. You loved him. I believe that. But you were not there. And whatever you explained to him in May, you explained it to a man whose own doctor had documented that he was vulnerable to exactly that kind of pressure. And you did not bring your own attorney to that conversation. And you did not bring his. Kevin looked away. Hargrove cleared his throat. He exchanged a look with his associate that contained a full conversation. Could you give us a moment? He said to Whitmore. We waited in a smaller room down the hall. It had a single window looking out over a parking structure and a ficus tree that appeared to be losing the battle. Whitmore poured himself a glass of water from a pitcher on the credenza and stood looking out the window with the patience of someone who has spent a professional lifetime in rooms like this. How long? I asked. 20 minutes, maybe 30. They need to recalibrate. He turned slightly. You did well in there. I just told the truth. That's usually what does well, he said. I sat in one of the chairs and looked at the ficus tree outside and thought about my father at his kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of notepaper, writing down what he wanted the world to know while his hands shook and the evening settled around him. Had he been afraid? I had thought about this many times in the past weeks. Not afraid of dying. Raymond Bennett had come to a practical peace with that long before the end, but afraid that the thing he had built over 76 years, the house, the family, the equal and deliberate love he had tried to divide fairly between his children, was being quietly dismantled while he was still in it. That the order he had established and maintained and entrusted to the right people was slipping out of his grip the way everything else had slipped, gradually and then all at once. I thought about him putting the note in the Bible, smoothing the pages closed, putting it back in the bedside drawer. He had done what he could. And then he had trusted me to do the rest. 23 minutes later, Hargrove's assistant came to the door and told us they were ready. The terms, when Hargrove laid them out, were closer to what we had asked for than I expected. Equal division of the property, to be accomplished either through a buyout, with Kevin paying me fair market value for half the house, or through a sale with proceeds split equally. The liquid assets divided 50-50 as the original plan had specified. Legal fees covered by the estate, and a settlement agreement that, in its formal language, acknowledged that the June 14th will represented a deviation from the consistently and repeatedly expressed distribution intentions of Raymond Charles Bennett. It did not use the words undue influence. Whitmore had told me it likely would not, but the language it did use was specific enough that anyone who read it would understand what it meant. That was what I had asked for. That was what I got. Kevin sat across the table while Hargrove presented the terms. He did not object to any of them. He nodded at the appropriate moments in the way of a man who has already made a private decision and is now watching the public version of it proceed. Whitmore reviewed each term carefully, asking 3 clarifying questions in his unhurried way. Then he looked at me. I thought about what George had said to me in his office before we drove downtown. Your father knew what he was asking you to do when he wrote that note. He knew it wasn't small. Yes, I said, I accept these terms. Hargrove's associate began preparing the formal paperwork. Whitmore began his own notation. The room became, briefly, a place of ordinary professional procedure, pens and papers, and the specific language of documents that are designed to outlast the people they describe. Kevin stood before the paperwork was finished. Excuse me for a minute, he said to no one in particular, and walked out of the conference room. I waited approximately 30 seconds. Then I followed him. He was in the hallway, standing by the window at the far end, looking out at the same view we had looked at from the conference room. Columbus below, the river, the streets. I walked to the window and stood beside him. We were quiet for a moment. Below us, a woman was walking a very large dog along the sidewalk, and the dog was interested in everything it passed. A fire hydrant, a planter, a discarded coffee cup, and the woman was patient with all of it. I told myself I was helping him, Kevin said. I did not respond. The tax thing was real, he continued. The complications with joint ownership were real. I wasn't making that up. I genuinely thought... He stopped. I thought it was simpler, cleaner, and if I'm being honest... He paused for a long time. If you're being honest, I said quietly, Dana and I have had a rough couple of years, financially. He said this like a confession, in the low register of something that has been held in too long. The business slowed down. We had the refinance, the kids' school fees. It wasn't desperate, but it was tight, and I kept thinking about the house and the accounts and what they would mean if... He stopped again. And then I came to visit in May, and Dad was so different than I remembered, so much smaller, and I thought maybe I could just organize things in a way that made sense. In a way that made sense for you, I said. He didn't deny it. We stood at the window and watched the woman with the large dog disappear around the corner. He loved you more, Kevin said, not bitterly, just plainly, like someone stating a fact they have carried a long time. That's not true, I said. It felt true. I turned to look at him. My younger brother, 38 years old, standing in a suit in a hallway, having just watched the legal maneuvering of the last 2 months arrive at its conclusion. He looked tired in a way that was not just today, a weariness that had been accumulating. He loved us differently, I said, because we were different. I was the one who stayed, and you were the one who left, and he understood both of those things about us without needing them to be the same. I paused. But Kevin, he was your father too, and you went into that room in May and you steered him away from what he wanted because you needed the money. That's what happened, and you're going to have to live with that regardless of how today ends. He was quiet for a moment. I know. He wrote it down, My voice was soft. He wanted me to know it wasn't what he meant, but I think he also wrote it because he needed to say it somewhere, that it wasn't right, even if no one ever found it. Kevin's jaw moved. His eyes were bright in a way that a man his age would not call what it was in a hallway outside a law conference room. He found the right person, he said finally. I looked at him for another moment. There was a version of this conversation where I said something generous, where I found the thread of grace that exists between siblings, even ones who have done each other serious harm and followed it somewhere better. I am not sure I was there yet. I am not sure Kevin had earned it yet, but I could see it from where I was standing, which was further than I had been able to see it a month ago. Come back and sign the paperwork, I said. He nodded. We walked back down the hall together. The formal settlement was finalized over the following 3 weeks. Kevin and Dana had decided to sell the Maplewood Lane property rather than arrange a buyout. Whitmore had told me this was likely, given what Kevin had shared about their finances. A buyout at fair market value would have required liquidity they didn't have. The house was listed in mid-June. I want to tell you what it felt like to walk through 4412 Maplewood Lane with a real estate agent, watching her measure rooms and make notes about light exposure and original hardwood flooring, because it felt like exactly what it was. The beginning of the end of something that could not be preserved, only honored. The house was not mine to keep. It was mine to have half of, which is a different thing, and I had spent enough of the past months making peace with the difference. What I could keep, I was keeping. The Bible, the note, the photograph of Tyler and me at the beach that had been tucked behind the front cover, the laminated medication chart I had made for the refrigerator, which I could not explain to anyone why I kept, but which I did, the hook by the back door where my father's keys had hung. Tyler had asked, carefully, whether he could have the toolbox from the workshop, the old red metal one, not the newer plastic cabinet, the one his grandfather had used for every repair in that house since before I was born. Obviously, I said. He carried it to the car himself, both hands on the handle, and put it in the trunk with the kind of care you use with something that is both heavy and breakable. The house sold in August, 37 days after listing, to a young family, a couple in their early 30s with a 4-year-old and a baby. When Whitmore told me the buyer's profile, I did something I had not planned on, which was laugh. Not from happiness exactly, but from the particular release of something that has been held too long. A young family, children. The maple tree my father had planted in the year of my birth, now large enough to shade the entire front yard, presiding over the arrival of the next version of that house's life. My father would have found this deeply satisfying. My share of the sale, combined with the equal division of the accounts, gave me something I had not had in 5 years of caregiving and 12 years of single motherhood, a foundation. Real financial ground to stand on. Enough for a down payment on a house of my own in a neighborhood close enough to Tyler's school that the commute wouldn't change, with a room I chose for myself and a kitchen counter that was nobody's but mine. Miriam came up from Cincinnati the weekend I moved in. She brought wine and a potted rosemary plant and the specific kind of practical energy she always brought to situations that required both celebration and work. We unpacked boxes and ate pizza on the floor of the new living room, and she told me at some point late in the evening that she had always known I was going to get through it. You didn't seem certain, I pointed out. I was certain, she said. You just couldn't see it from where you were standing. Tyler helped me hang curtains the following Saturday. He is very tall now, taller than his father, taller than I expected him to become. And he stood on the stepladder with his grandfather's patience and the specific focused competence of someone who was raised in a house where things got fixed. When the curtain rod was level, he came down from the ladder and stood back and assessed it with his head tilted slightly. Grandpa would say it needs to go up another ½ inch, he told me. Grandpa was very particular about curtain rods, I said. He was particular about everything, Tyler said. That's why everything he did lasted. He picked up the toolbox from the floor and carried it to the garage. I watched him go and thought about a Saturday in July, 2 summers ago, when Tyler and my father had sat in the backyard after dinner and my father had told him that this house would take care of us, that I had earned every room of it. He was right, just not in the way he had intended. Kevin called in late September. I had not blocked his number. I had considered it in the weeks following the settlement, but I had decided against it for a reason I was not entirely able to articulate then and am still working toward now. He is my brother. That is a fact that the last 6 months did not change, only clarified, placed in sharper relief the way certain objects look different after you clean the glass you were looking at them through. He called on a Tuesday evening. Tyler was at the kitchen table working on a college application. I stepped into the backyard and answered. "Hey," Kevin said. "Hey." The familiar ritual of the opening. Two people trying to locate the right register for a conversation that doesn't have a map. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that Dana and I have started talking to a financial counselor about the business and the debt and all of it." A pause. "I should have done that a long time ago instead of—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I'm glad," I said. "I also wanted to—" He stopped again. Kevin had always been more comfortable with easy language than with the kind that cost something. I could hear him working at it. I looked at that note again, the one from Dad. I asked Hargrove for the copy we had made. I waited. "I've been thinking about what he must have felt," Kevin said. "Writing it, knowing he'd signed something he didn't mean and not knowing how to undo it, trying to trust that you'd find it and figure it out." Another pause. "He trusted you to fix something I broke. That's what it was." The backyard of my new house was small. Nothing like the garden at Maplewood Lane, no 40-year maple, no workshop, no raised beds my father had built from cedar planks and stubbornness. But there was a single oak in the corner, old enough to have been someone else's planting, solid and indifferent to the small human dramas happening beneath it. "He trusted me," I said, "and he was right to." "Yes," Kevin said. He was. We were quiet for a moment. A neighbor's porch light came on. Somewhere down the street, someone was grilling, and the smell of it drifted over the fence in the way that smells do on September evenings. Generous, unhurried, belonging to everyone. "I'm not ready to be fine," I said. "About what happened. I want you to know that." "I know. But I'm also not interested in spending the rest of my life managing this as the thing that defines us." "What does that mean?" he asked carefully. "It means I'm not closing the door," I said, "but I'm not pretending we're somewhere we're not. We have a lot of ground to cover before we get back to something real." A pause. "Okay," he said. "It's going to take time." "I have time," he said. "I'd like to use it better than I have been." I looked at the oak tree in the corner of my backyard, an old tree, patient in the way of things that have been standing long enough to stop caring about the short view. "So would I said. We talked for a few more minutes. Nothing significant, nothing resolved, but the kind of conversation that functions as a marker. A small flag in the ground saying, "This is the place where we began trying to find our way back. We may not get there. I am honest enough to hold that possibility. But the flag is there." I went back inside. Tyler looked up from his laptop. "Uncle Kevin?" "Yeah." He considered this for a moment with the seriousness he brought to complicated things. "How was it?" "A start," I said. He nodded and went back to his application. Tyler's first choice college letter arrived on a Thursday in November. He had applied early decision to Ohio State's nursing program. A choice that surprised some people and surprised me not at all. He had grown up watching me do it, and he had understood from closer proximity than most people get what the work actually required. Not just the clinical knowledge, but the other thing. The thing you can't teach in a classroom. The willingness to sit with someone in the hard moments and not look away. He got in. We stood in the kitchen in the November afternoon and read the letter together, and then he put both arms around me in the way he occasionally still did, briefly and without warning, the way he had when he was small and the world felt large, and I was the fixed point he oriented himself around. "Grandpa would have been so proud," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to do it right." I believed him completely. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, in my kitchen, in my house, on ground I had purchased with money that was mine by right and by law and by the quiet, penciled determination of a man who had raised me to finish things. And I wrote a letter. Not to Kevin, not to Whitmore, not to Dr. Marchetti, not to any of the people who had been part of the 6 months that had just changed the shape of my life. I wrote a letter to my father. I know he couldn't read it. I am not a person who is sentimental about that kind of thing in any way I could defend logically. But there are moments when the only thing that fits the size of what you feel is the act of writing it down. He had taught me that, as it turned out, by example. I told him that Tyler got in. I told him the house sold to a young family with children who would grow up under his maple tree, which felt right. I told him that George Whitmore was exactly who he had said he was, and that I understood now why he had kept that name in reserve like something he knew might be needed. I told him that the rosemary plant Miriam brought me was thriving on the kitchen windowsill, which would have pleased him because he had always kept rosemary. I told him I found the note. I told him I understood what it cost him to write it, the physical effort, the clarity it required to stay clear long enough to do it, the act of trust it took to put it somewhere and believe that I would look in the right place. I told him that finding it in the Bible felt like him, that he had always known which things I paid attention to. I told him that I was going to be all right, that Tyler was going to be all right, that the ground was solid under us and that we knew who put it there. I folded the letter and slid it inside my copy of the will contest settlement in the envelope at the back. Someday Tyler might read it. Or no one would, and it would simply sit there being true. Either way was fine. There is a thing that happens when you have spent a long time in the middle of something hard, where the end of it doesn't feel the way you imagined. You expect relief to arrive like weather, a clear front moving in, a change you can feel in your whole body. What actually happens is quieter. You realize one ordinary Tuesday that the weight you have been carrying has simply become lighter. Not gone. Lighter. Redistributed into something you can manage without thinking about it every moment. I am there now. Or close enough to it to say so. I am still a nurse. I still keep a drawer of granola bars at the nurse's station because there are long shifts and there are colleagues who forget to eat, and that particular habit is not going anywhere. I still drive past Maplewood Lane occasionally, not deliberately, but the route from the hospital takes me near it sometimes, and I don't go out of my way to avoid it. The new family has put a swing set in the backyard. I can see the top of it above the fence when I pass. The maple tree is bare now. November. The same bare-branched patience it has had every November since before I was born. My father planted that tree because he believed in the long view, because he understood that the things worth having take time and require faith in an outcome you won't live to see. He was right about that. He was right about most things, once you subtracted the May visit and the law firm and the particular confusion of a man whose judgment was failing in ways he could not fully track. What remained underneath all of it was a man who knew his daughter, who knew what she had done and what she deserved, and who found the last available means to say so. He put it in the Bible. He signed his full name. I found it. If there is something I want you to hold from this story, it is not the legal strategy or the documents or the settlement figure. Those were the means. The end was simpler than any of that. My father wrote down the truth when speaking it was no longer available to him. He trusted that the right person would find it. That trust was not misplaced. I think about the women I know, and I suspect if you are listening to this, you may know them too, who have spent years being the one who stays. The one who manages, who coordinates, who shows up at 2 a.m. and drives to the appointments and keeps the laminated chart on the refrigerator. The one who is told she is amazing and incredible from a distance that never closes into actual help. The one who is expected to absorb every cost of that work without expecting anything in return. Because asking would be ungenerous, because need is uncomfortable, because the story that gets told about families like this prefers certain people invisible. I stayed because I loved my father. I want that to be the truth, and it is the truth. But staying was also a choice that cost me something real over 5 years, in ways that did not disappear because no one was keeping track. My mother knew that. She put language in a legal document specifically because she knew that the one who does the work should not be the one who loses. She was right. You are allowed to know what your contribution is worth. You are allowed to expect that the people who benefit from your presence in their lives acknowledge it with something more than admiration at a safe distance. You are allowed to find a George Whitmore and walk into a room on the 14th floor and lay down what you know and wait for it to be enough and believe that it will be. You are allowed to find the note in the Bible and trust what it says. Sometimes the people who love us most tell us the truth too late and too quietly, but they tell us. And sometimes all they need to have it matter is for us to be the kind of person who looks in the right places. My father raised me to be that person. I found the note. The rest followed. To Tyler, who kept track when I couldn't, who carried the toolbox himself, who is going to be an extraordinary nurse. Thank you for being exactly who you are. To my father, Raymond Charles Bennett, who built a house on high ground and meant every room of it for both his children, and who found a way to say so even when the words were hard to hold. I found it, Dad. I heard you. I got it right. Thank you for staying with me through every part of this story. It means more than I can say to know that these words found you, wherever you are, whatever you've been carrying, whatever house of your own you are trying to hold on to or find your way back to. You are not alone in that. If this story moves something in you, please consider subscribing to this channel. Every story I tell is for someone who needs to hear it. Your subscription means I can keep telling them. And if you know someone who is the one who stays, the one who shows up, who carries the weight, who is told how amazing she is without ever being truly seen, share this with her. Sometimes the thing that changes everything is simply knowing that someone else knows exactly how it feels. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. I'll see you in the next one.